global politics, right? It's a wild ride, like a constant chess match.
Oh.
Alliances shifting, new power plays all the time.
Yeah.
Today, we are going deep on some interesting whispers and rumors, stuff around the conflict in Ukraine, and with this new Trump administration, what Russia might do next.
Yeah, it is a really crucial moment with so many different things happening at the same time. To really understand it, we need to go beyond just the headlines. We need to try and get into the heads of the major players, especially now as the conflict in Ukraine enters this new and unpredictable phase.
So true. Okay, let's jump in. There's been a lot of talk about a split in the Trump administration on the Ukraine war. NBC's report, it looks like there's this growing sense that the U.S. needs a way out. But how? There's a real back and forth.
Yeah, that seems to be the consensus, that the war was a mistake. But two distinct factions are emerging, and each has a very different approach to how the U.S. should proceed.
So like the hawks and the doves? Have you heard that?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good way to describe it. The hawks, people like Mike Walsh and General Kellogg, they think the U.S. needs to double down on pressuring Russia, to force concessions. They're talking about more sanctions, more weapons, and maybe even those strikes on Russian territory that have been floating around.
Oh, wow. So trying to force a win, even if it's just for appearances so they can pull out?
Pretty much, yeah. But the thing is, the sanctions haven't exactly crippled Russia.
Yeah.
And if things escalate further, it could be really bad for the global economy. It's a big risk.
What about the doves then? What's their take?
Well, this group, it's mainly unnamed officials, they seem to believe Ukraine is a lost cause. The U.S. should just cut its losses and let Europe deal with the mess. Some are even saying that the Maidan coup back in 2014, the one that kicked out the pro-Russian president, and the push for NATO expansion afterward were missteps, that they provoked Russia in the first place.
Oh, interesting. Reminds me of what Steve Bannon used to say about Trump owning the war if he doesn't step back, like he did in Afghanistan.
Yeah, it is an interesting parallel. And then there's Trump's announcement about pulling troops out of Syria, even though there was pushback during his first term. It seems like he really wants to reduce U.S. military involvement.
So he might be leaning towards the doves approach then, if you look at his past actions. But what about his base? Do you think they would be on board with a withdrawal from Ukraine?
I think it would likely resonate with a lot of his supporters. People are tired of these endless wars and wary of U.S. interventionism. He was elected, in part, because he promised to put America first, remember, and to avoid these foreign entanglements.
Makes sense. But how is Russia reacting to all this U.S. drama?
Well, they have said that they are open to negotiations, but some recent statements from their top diplomats, Lavrov and Ryabkov, make it pretty clear that they won't be pressured into concessions. They're demanding dialogue that's based on equality and a recognition of their interests.
Sounds like they're not really interested in helping the U.S. save face.
No, not at all. They have survived the sanctions. Actually, they've regained some global standing, and they are not backing down from what they see as their core objectives.
That comment from Lavrov really struck me, about Trump admitting that pushing Ukraine toward NATO was a mistake. I mean, that's a big statement for a U.S. president to make.
Yeah, it's definitely significant. It shows a real shift in the geopolitical landscape. Russia's not playing the same game anymore. They have shown that they are resilient, and now they're playing for keeps.
We've got this internal struggle within the Trump administration, and a Russia that's standing firm. But the war is still happening. There's a new Ukrainian commander, General Dradi, who has been trying to launch counterattacks, especially in the Kupiansk region.
We've seen this before. A new general, a new offensive, but then, well, things usually stall.
Why do you think these counteroffensives struggle to make a real difference?
I think a lot of them lack the strategic planning and resources to actually push through the Russian lines. They end up being more about appeasing Zelensky, showing that he is taking action and keeping morale up. It's not really about achieving a real military victory.
Some more for show.
Pretty much. And the Russians are expecting it. They tend to anticipate these moves and take back any lost ground. It just highlights the imbalance of power.
It's like a game of tug of war where one side's way stronger. Speaking of surprises, what's the latest on those reports about North Korean troops fighting with the Russians?
Yeah, those might have been a little premature. The evidence, like the videos of those supposed captured North Korean soldiers, it's being questioned. The whole thing is starting to unravel.
Why do you think this kind of misinformation takes off so quickly, especially in a situation like this?
Well, we are in the middle of an information war, really. Every side is trying to control the narrative, and it can be really hard to separate fact from fiction, especially with the fog of war and all that.
We have to be extra careful about what we believe then, especially with the stakes this high.
Absolutely. It's a good reminder to always be critical of information, especially when it comes to conflicts like this.
Lots to think about here. We've got this internal struggle in the Trump administration, a Russia that's not backing down, and a war that seems to be at a turning point.
Yeah, it's a complicated situation, and it's changing rapidly. To really grasp it, we need to dig deeper into what each of these key players is thinking and what their goals are.
Good point. And speaking of key players, Lavrov said some very interesting things about Trump's recent statements on Ukraine.
He did, and those comments reveal a lot about how Russia is approaching things now and how they see the possibility of a negotiated settlement.
Let's get into those comments after the break. I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on what they might mean for the future of this conflict.
Sounds good. We'll dive into those remarks and what they could imply.
Okay, so right before the break, we were talking about those comments that Lavrov made about Trump's statements on Ukraine. You said that they were pretty revealing about what Russia is thinking right now. Can you say more about that?
Absolutely. Lavrov's comments, especially the ones he made during that ambassador roundtable, they give us a really interesting look at how Russia is handling this phase of the conflict and what they might be expecting from the new Trump administration.
What was the most important thing to you? What really stood out?
Well, for one thing, Lavrov seemed to genuinely acknowledge and even kind of welcome Trump's admission that it was a mistake to try and get Ukraine into NATO. He even went as far as to call it a breakthrough.
Yeah, I remember that. It was something like, for the first time, a Western leader, and not just any leader, the leader of the United States said these words out loud. That's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, it is. And it seems to show that the Russians are taking what Trump said at face value, that they see it as a potential shift in U.S. policy, like maybe the start of a new kind of conversation.
So they're hopeful.
Mm-hmm.
But do they actually trust the U.S.? I mean, there's a lot of history here, right?
You're totally right. Lavrov was pretty open about his doubts about the West actually keeping its promises. He brought up examples like the Minsk agreements, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Western Sahara, all these times when Russia thinks the West either didn't keep their word or just flat out ignored international law.
Didn't he even mention Trump specifically? Something about his comments on moving people from Gaza?
Yeah, he did. And remember, this was in front of a bunch of ambassadors, so it was definitely a message for a wider audience. He was basically saying, look, we need to see action, not just hear words. How can we trust you to follow through on agreements in the future when you haven't in the past?
Good point. Sounds like they're cautiously optimistic, but not naive.
Exactly. They're offering an olive branch, but they're also setting boundaries.
So that's Lavrov. But what about the guy who'd probably be leading the talks for Russia if they actually happen? What's his take?
You mean Sergei Rabkov, the deputy foreign minister. His statements were even more direct and assertive, actually.
I'm all ears. Tell me more.
Ryabkov pretty much laid down the rules for any future talks. He made it crystal clear that Russia is willing to talk, but they're not desperate. He basically dismissed the idea of falling into the arms of the new U.S. administration, no matter the cost.
No more playing the victim, then.
Yeah, exactly. He really emphasized that any talks have to be based on mutual respect and seeing each other as equals, and that the U.S. needs to be the one to make the first move if they want to get things back to normal. He even said that the U.S. has to acknowledge the realities on the ground and respect Russia's national interests because of history and geography.
History and geography. Those are pretty loaded phrases.
Yeah.
What do you think he's getting at?
It's definitely open to interpretation, but it seems like he's suggesting that Russia's not just going to go back to how things were before the war. They've gained territory and global influence, and they're not going to just give that up.
So it's not just about Ukraine anymore, is it? It's about who has power in the world.
Exactly. This is about who gets to make the rules, who has influence, who calls the shots. Russia is making it clear that they're a major power and they won't be pushed around or ignored.
It's a bold move, that's for sure.
Okay.
It's going to be interesting to see what happens. It feels like the U.S., even with a new president, is going to have a hard time accepting this new reality.
Well, it's a good observation. The U.S. has been so used to being the world's superpower. Getting used to a world where there are other powerful countries like Russia and China is going to require a huge shift in their thinking.
So, zooming out for a second, what does this all mean in the big picture?
It brings up a really important question about what global order will look like in the future. Are we going to see another Cold War type of situation? Or can we come up with a new system where multiple countries share power? The answer probably depends on how the U.S. decides to react to this new reality.
Things are getting pretty intense. Let's talk about what's happening on the ground in Ukraine.
Yeah. While all this diplomacy is going on, the war is still happening.
So we've got this back and forth between the U.S. and Russia. But the war in Ukraine is still raging. What's the latest on that?
As we said earlier, the Ukrainians, under their new commander, General Dradi, have been launching these counterattacks to try and get back some of the territory they've lost.
How's that going? Are they having any success?
They've been facing really strong resistance from the Russians. We're seeing fighting around places like Kupiansk, Svatov, and Kremina, but they haven't made any major breakthroughs.
I thought the Russians were the ones supposed to be on the offensive. Why are the Ukrainians the ones doing the attacking?
Part of it is the pressure on Zelensky. He has to show that they're fighting back, that they're not giving up. So he's pushing for these counteroffensives. But a lot of times they just don't have the resources or the strategy to really push the Russians out.
So they're more about appearances than actual results.
Yeah, in a way. They might win a few battles here and there, but they're not really changing the overall balance of power. And the Russians seem to be expecting these attacks. They're usually ready for them and can take back any lost ground.
It makes you wonder if these attacks are actually hurting them in the long run. They might look good in the short term, but they could be using up valuable resources and soldiers.
Yeah, that's a good point. It makes you think that maybe a different approach would be better in the long run. One that focuses on defense and wearing down the enemy instead of these risky offensives.
So while the Ukrainians are struggling, what are the Russians doing? Are they just waiting for the next attack?
Oh, no, not at all. They're actually continuing to make progress in a few key areas. They've been especially good at expanding their positions on those rivers we mentioned, Dioskal and Zarabets.
Those rivers were supposed to be natural barriers, right? What happened?
They were, but the Russians have been really smart about it. They've used their engineering skills to build temporary bridges and secure crossings. Basically, they've turned those rivers from obstacles into launching points for more attacks.
Okay, so what's next for them? Do you think they're going to launch a big attack?
There's a lot of talk about that. People have been saying that they've been building up troops and equipment, but they've been pretty careful so far. Some think they've been waiting for the weather to get better, for colder, drier conditions that would make it easier to use their tanks and heavy artillery.
So we might see things really ramp up in the next few weeks.
It's definitely possible. If the weather improves and there's no progress with the diplomats, we might see a major Russian offensive soon.
It's hard to predict what's going to happen, huh?
It really is. And that's what makes this whole situation so interesting and so worrying. There are so many things happening, and the stakes are incredibly high.
This has been a really insightful deep dive. So what are the main takeaways for our listeners?
I think the biggest thing to remember is that this situation is a lot more complicated than it might seem at first glance. There's a lot of history involved, power is shifting, and the future is really uncertain. What happens in Ukraine will have a big impact on the entire world.
It reminds us that we need to stay informed, be careful about the information we believe, and try to understand all the different sides.
Absolutely. And it shows how important diplomacy is and how we need to find ways to reduce tensions before things get even worse.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. I think we all learned a lot today.
It was my pleasure.
Subscribe to our podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. Okay, so we've got this whole diplomatic dance happening between the U.S. and Russia, but the war in Ukraine, it's still going on. What's the situation like on the ground right now?
Well, the Ukrainians, under their new commander, General Dradi, they've been trying to launch counterattacks, trying to take back some of that territory they've lost.
And how's that been going? Are they making any progress?
It's been tough. They're facing really fierce resistance from the Russians. We're seeing clashes around Kupiansk, Svatov, Kremina, those areas, but no real breakthroughs yet.
But I thought the Russians were the ones on the offensive. Why are the Ukrainians the ones launching attacks?
Well, there's a lot of pressure on Zelensky, right? He needs to show that they're fighting back, that they're not giving up. So he's pushing for these counteroffensives. But a lot of times, they just don't have what it takes, the resources and the strategy to really push the Russians back.
So more for show than anything else.
Kinda, yeah. It's about morale and showing that they're willing to fight, but they're not really changing the overall situation. And the Russians, they know this. They're usually ready for these attacks, and they can take back any ground they lose pretty quickly.
Makes you wonder if these offensives are actually hurting them more in the long run. Like maybe they look good now, but they could be using up resources and troops that they'll need later.
That's a really good point. It raises the question of whether a different approach would be better, focusing on defense, wearing down the enemy instead of these big, risky attacks.
So while the Ukrainians are struggling, what are the Russians doing? Just sitting back and waiting?
Not at all. They're actually continuing to make gains in some key areas. They've been especially successful at expanding their presence on those rivers we talked about earlier, the Oskil and Zarabets.
Weren't those rivers supposed to be like natural barriers? What happened?
They were, but the Russians have been very strategic. They've used their engineering skills, building pontoon bridges, securing crossing points. So they've basically turned those rivers from obstacles into launching pads for their own operations.
So what's next for the Russians? Think they're planning a major offensive.
There's been a lot of talk about that, a lot of speculation. There are reports that they've been gathering troops and equipment, but they've been pretty restrained so far. Some experts think they've been waiting for the weather to change, waiting for colder, drier conditions so they can use their tanks and heavy artillery more effectively.
So we could see things escalate pretty quickly in the next few weeks.
It's possible, yeah. If the weather improves and the diplomatic efforts don't go anywhere, we might see a big Russian offensive in the near future.
Wow. So much to think about. This has been a really eye-opening look at this whole situation. So what are the key takeaways for our listeners today?
I think the main thing is this is much more complicated than it might seem at first. There's a lot of history involved. The balance of power is shifting and the future is really uncertain. What happens in Ukraine will have huge consequences for the whole world.
It's a reminder to stay informed, to be critical of what we hear and read, and to try to understand all the different sides.
Exactly. And it shows how important diplomacy is. We need to find ways to de-escalate this before it gets even worse.
That's a good point. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a really insightful discussion.
My pleasure.
Subscribe to our podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear.